Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, May 18th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, in Congress, a tied vote, a stalled reconciliation package, and big questions about how laws actually get finished. Plus, agency reorganization plans can look clean on paper, but turn out far messier in real life. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. Last year, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth directed the military services to reduce the number of permanent change of station moves by 50%. The Air Force, in partnership with RAND, then took a closer look at how longer assignments and fewer moves would impact budgets, readiness, retention, and the career development of airmen. To understand more about RAND's findings, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Lisa Harrington, senior operations researcher, and Kelly Atkinson, political scientist, both from RAND.
At a high level, we found that there are cost savings opportunities the Air Force can pursue, and we found that some of the most effective changes that make in order to generate the largest amount of cost savings for annual budgets would be to lengthen overseas assignments by a certain amount and lengthen stateside assignments when able. And that means tours that are not controlled tours, so tours that are not a set amount of time based on the mission being accomplished. Those could stay the same, but all other tours could be lengthened stateside in order to reduce the number of moves. We also found that if you change the length of assignments, it will have impacts on existing models for career development and expectations for what military members need to do to be competitive for promotion. And so what we recommended is that if you do end up changing the assignment length, the Air Force will need to adjust career development expectations and communicate those to the force in order to ensure that the relationship between assignments and career development moves in parallel with these changes.
So some of the other ways we looked at the problem that could address this. So we looked, for example, at opportunities for leaving people in the same general vicinity, but yet being able to take on jobs that have increasing responsibility. So there could be opportunities at certain locations, and definitely for certain AFSCs, there are these kinds of hubs where people can have multiple jobs at different levels, but that don't require a PCS, don't require an assignment move. So that was one of the things we explored to see how much that could happen over and above the way it has happened historically, and what sort of things would that drive. The other thing that we looked at also had to do with the extent to which the Air Force is currently following policies that limit the movement of people. So in some cases, there might be a policy that says, if you go to this kind of an assignment, you're required to stay for a certain amount of time. We find that over history, if we look at historically, there are often times when people are released from those kinds of jobs and not held to that assignment duration for other very good mission-related reasons. But to the extent that the Air Force can continue to follow its own policies, there's an opportunity to reduce the number of PCSs there as well.
I'll add a bit more to that. So clarifying what I said earlier about extending overseas tours and enforcing longer tours stateside, specifically, we find that extending certain overseas tours could generate $186 million in annual savings from the Air Force's PCS budget, and enforcing a 5-year tour length for many assignments in the continental United States could generate $240 million in annual savings. And these are savings from the operational and rotational budgets for permanent change of station moves that the Air Force follows on an annual basis. We also found that frequency for moves and preference for how often personnel move is not the same throughout the force. So there are some people who want to move more frequently, and there are some people who want more stability and they want longer assignments. So the Air Force, what we found is that the Air Force can capitalize on the variation that exists at present in the population of service members. They can think about preferences that service members have for how often they want to move, and they can adjust policy to maximize some of those preferences. So if we analyzed exit survey data, and we found that junior enlisted tend to leave the service and cite that they're moving too infrequently. They want to move more. And so they're leaving the service because they wanted to join to see the world, but they're not moving enough. Whereas officers, specifically FGOs, they leave because they're moving too much. And so when they're completing an exit survey, they're indicating too many PCS moves as a reason to justify and explain why they're leaving. So what we find is that there are population differences that exist within enlisted and officer, or even across career fields. And the Air Force can do a better job understanding those differing desires for move frequency. And then they could find ways to allow service members to have more agency in choosing to move frequently, or saying, no, I want to stay, and I understand that could impact my career development accordingly.
You also had this stakeholder workshop to kind of better understand the assignment system and explore policy options for extending assignment durations, while also balancing costs and readiness and retention. What were some of the major findings there, and maybe points of consensus in that discussion?
So I'll start, Kelly. I really think that it's very interesting how difficult it can be to get people out of the current mindset for how assignments are made and the impacts those have on a career and how a career looks. Really, the amount of moves that an officer, for example, might make on their pathway to becoming a general officer or even a colonel and being promotable along the way, that's really cultural. That's really internal to the Air Force. There's not hard evidence that they lean on to say that you must make that many moves, because then you're going to learn the things you need to learn for your, to be a qualified officer at that rank. Rather, it's more about looking at the record and seeing how many jobs they've had and that kind of a thing as the goal. So it is very interesting. And one of the things that we did talk about quite a bit in the project, how people really see things through the lens of what they experience themselves and what they know to be a pathway for a career.
I definitely agree with Lisa. I think specifically in the workshop, what we heard is that, no, you have to move for development. And people kept saying that throughout the workshop and also throughout this project when we interviewed people. Well, you have to move for development. So if you make assignments longer, that will disrupt that reality, that rule that you must move for development. And in the project, we took the perspective that the process of moving and the system of career development are not causing each other. That if you change one, in this instance, if you start with changing the length of assignment, that's your baseline. And then afterwards, you'll just have to adjust career development models and communicate that to the force. It's not an impossible problem. You simply have to decide we're changing one aspect. And as a result, career development will have to change. So in the workshop, we did try to encourage participants to disrupt that mindset of you must move for development and say, not necessarily. If you stayed in place longer, what would have to change with career development expectations? And they did reflect that you would need to change those guidelines for promotion, guidelines for when people are meeting boards, when people are going to school. But again, they reflected that would be difficult to do. And I think consensus was also that you could adjust some things in a small way, but there was pessimism about whether you could change the whole system in a big enough way. So I think the workshop showed us that the cultural expectation for moving associated with positive career development is deeply entrenched within the force.
The other expectation that we tried to have good discussion on has to do also with the idea that there should just generally be this one-size-fits-all process by which you decide whether to move people. So does it make sense that for officers, for example, that all AFSCs and all career fields are moving at the same pace? That that generally the schedule for moving is relatively the same? Perhaps not. I mean, there could be aspects of functions that make it more beneficial for people to stay in one place longer, longer to learn the job. And once they do, it's good to leave them there. There's operational reasons why it might be good to move people more often or less often. But so that idea of placing just a single process over top of the entire, both officer and enlisted force, independent of the AFSC, that's, we tried to see if we couldn't get participants to think through that as well and think about treating AFSCs differently as well.
Given all that, what would then implementation look like? What are some of the considerations there?
What we found and what we outline in our policy recommendations is that if the Air Force wants to generate significant cost savings by changing assignment policy, they will need to make overarching large-scale changes. Small adjustments will not yield enduring cost savings results. I think with that in mind, we recommend that the Air Force decide what level of change it wants to make. And that could be in order to meet DOW directives for cost savings, or it could be to make a systemic change for the service itself, because that's where the Air Force wants to go. But implementation will be challenging because of the constraints that we've talked about. People have a certain expectation for what their career will look like. People have an expectation for what their PCS cycle will look like and how that will connect to career development. So for implementation, once the Air Force decides what cost savings it wants to achieve and what model it wants to adopt, we outline where they can make those changes for CONUS assignments, for OCONUS assignments. We model different excursions for changes they can make in those assignment cycles. So we sort of provide a menu for how they can achieve some of those cost savings. I recommend that if they do pursue changes, clear strategic communication to the field is necessary, because you want to make sure everyone understands the reason for these changes and how they will impact their career development progression.
That's RAND's Kelly Atkinson, political scientist, and Lisa Harrington, senior operations researcher, speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, in Congress, a tied vote, a stalled reconciliation package, and big questions about how laws actually get finished. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize, secure operations, and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Congress is wrestling with big questions, but it's the details that are slowing everything down. That tension between ambition and execution shows up across the agenda, and it's shaping what happens next. Here to bring us up to speed on the details is WTOP's Capitol Hill correspondent, Mitchell Miller. Mitchell, great to have you on this morning. Thanks so much for joining me.
Absolutely.
We only have 10 minutes. We could talk for an hour, but let's start with international affairs. The president is just back from his trip to China. What were the reactions from folks on the Hill?
I think many lawmakers are just glad that the trip did not cause, frankly, any additional problems between these two countries. There's still a lot of concerns among lawmakers about China trying to impose its will on Taiwan. There's been talk in congressional hearings about stepped-up naval operations in the South China Sea. So there is still some concern about what China is trying to do or not do. But also there was some concern that things might not go the right way in connection with what's happening with the Strait of Hormuz. And essentially, it kind of seemed to be a status quo situation where both countries, again, are trying to work their own will, but nothing really blew up in connection with this summit. So I think overall, lawmakers are generally satisfied, maybe a little bit underwhelmed. I know the president has said that there are various trade agreements, but it was just kind of like I said, more of a status quo. It was almost more about the meeting itself than what came out of it.
Sort of a do no harm approach.
Exactly.
Well, speaking of international relations, let's talk about the Middle East. We had another war powers vote in the House this past week.
Right. And I think we're getting closer and closer to the point where Congress is going to try to reassert itself. We've seen these votes in the House and the Senate getting closer and closer as just a few more Republicans keep edging toward deciding that they want to see the administration take some kind of specific actions and try to wind down this war. The vote last week, 212-212. Literally one vote could have changed it. And it went down to defeat because it was a deadlock. But you had three Republicans voting with Democrats. One Democrat went against his party. But I think that the next time it comes up, it's very possible that the War Powers Resolution in the House could pass. And it's very similar situation in the Senate. The vote there was 50-49. Again, just a few Republicans joining Democrats. I think the fact that we've passed this 60-day resolution date that the Congress is supposed to say whether or not the president can move forward with military action, the fact that that has passed now for quite a while really has reawakened the need, at least among many lawmakers, for some type of congressional weigh-in on this issue.
Mitchell, that tie vote just points to how close the margins are, and the House redistricting fight really got tossed on its head last week. Walk us through the current status of that.
Well, this has really now become political war, and that really isn't that much of an exaggeration. The fact that the Democrats got rocked on their heels by the Virginia Supreme Court ruling that said that they could not move forward with 4 seats that would have given them a 10-1 versus a 6-5 margin, that really caused a huge stir within the Democratic Party. And then, of course, you've had all of these states in the South since the U.S. Supreme Court decision on the Voting Rights Act moving forward to eliminate black majority districts, or at least Democrat districts, whether it's in Tennessee, Louisiana. Florida has released a map with 4 new seats for Republicans. So last week, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who really led the effort for Democrats to try to fight back against this redistricting by Republicans, he pledged that they are still going to win in November in the midterms. And he used the term that they will crush their souls, referring to the Republicans. Now, the Democrats only have so many options at this point because legally and with the courts, there's just not enough time. A lot of these elections are actually getting underway. There is kind of a Hail Mary attempt, for example, in Maryland, where there is still an effort to get the state Senate President Bill Ferguson to go along with redistricting that would eliminate the one Republican seat held by Andy Harris, who's the head of the House Freedom Caucus. But I'm doubtful that is going to happen. So really, it's going to be back to the basics, I think, that the Democrats are going to try to use the polling that shows that they have a good chance of retaking the House, but certainly it's a lot closer now since you have all these potential pickups due to redistricting by Republicans with that very tight margin, as you noted.
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, with all of this tension on the Hill, what is happening to member relations? How are people getting along? I mean, everything that they've got to move forward is requiring some kind of compromise.
Right. And it's still very difficult, even on a good day. But now with the elections coming up and this redistricting really poisoning the well, if you will, in connection with what's happening. And so, for example, you have the budget reconciliation process, which is fiercely partisan right now. Of course, Republicans are taking the lead on trying to get their ICE and border protection money approved, more than $70 billion. And they have to go, of course, through the Senate parliamentarian. Democrats are fighting them every inch of the way. And that's why you saw last week, for example, the parliamentarian, at least initially, said many large parts of Border Patrol and some of the other provisions in the GOP legislation had to be knocked out. So they are reworking that. So you're going to see a lot of that from Democrats, where they'll claim these little mini victories as they try to slow things down for Republicans.
It seems like every legislative package is now a dueling versions headline. We have the housing bill and the aviation safety bills that are getting a lot of attention.
Right. So, for example, on the housing bill, you have the fact that the Senate said, okay, we approved this a long time ago. The president is behind it. Let's get it approved and across the finish line. But of course, the House has other ideas. And so they are making changes, and they are likely to vote on that this week. It looks like they're going to try to do it through suspension of the rules, which would mean a 2/3 vote. So they're going to have to get Democrats on board. Some of the things that are involved in that is it would scale back the Senate's limitations on institutional investors in the housing market. It's something that the Senate wanted. The House does not. The House has a lot of other things that they want to add into this. This is a problem for both the House and the Senate, obviously. And we've talked about this before. There's this increasing tension, not just between Democrats and Republicans, but within the Republican Party, between the House and the Senate to try to get these things done. And then you move over to the aviation bills. The rotor versus the alert bills is a huge battle in connection with basically what happened after the deadly accident at Reagan National Airport that killed 67 people back in 2025. You had the Senate's Rotor Act, which is much more narrow. It was looking at expanding what's called ADS-B-In, which is for cockpit traffic awareness. And then on the House side, they are taking a much more general approach where they want to add in a lot of different provisions. And so these two pieces of legislation are now at odds, and it's really angered some of the members of the Senate, Republicans who had, including Ted Cruz, who had supported this. The head of the NTSB is not happy about the fact that the House is moving in its own direction, but that's where we are.
Mitchell, I'm kind of curious. Both of those bills, the housing bill, the aviation bills, really cover a lot of technical matter. There's a crypto bill that's creeping through. Mm-hmm. Given the Supreme Court rulings from the last couple of years that reduced the executive branch's ability to legislate through regulation, if you will, are you seeing members of Congress write in more of the technical aspects of these issues into the legislation?
Yes, that's a very good point, because they know that because, as you mentioned, the courts have ruled in the way that you mentioned, that they have to put in these very specific pieces of technical language. Otherwise, it may not get through, or it may be ignored. And that's just one of the examples of what's happening with the Rotor Act. I mean, that's why they tailored it very specifically in connection with these requirements of what happens in the cockpit. And there's also similar technical language in the Alert Act as well, because there's concern that if things are not specifically spelled out, and we saw this writ large with the DOGE Act, that if you don't specifically say what Congress wants, then with these rulings over the past few months and years, the executive branch may say, well, we're not going to do that because it was never specifically laid out by Congress.
It's a really interesting point of tension then, because the technicalities are where they're getting hung up.
Exactly.
Well, there is a little bit of good news. If we switch topics to 2027 appropriations, some of the bills are starting to move and get votes.
How about that? We even saw a checkered flag for, at least in the House, for the VA military construction vote. Overwhelming bipartisan vote last week for more than $150 billion related to that appropriations project. That, of course, is just one of 12. But at this point, as we've talked about with all this tension here on Capitol Hill, they will take victories where they can. But that, of course, is just the start of this whole appropriations process. And believe it or not, here we are in May. But yes, there is already talk about some concern getting into the fall with all the election tension going back and forth, that there could be another government shutdown. And related to that, the Senate last week passed legislation that would prohibit senators from being paid during a government shutdown.
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, thank you for joining me. I'm certainly glad you've got plenty of stuff to cover.
No shortage ever.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the IRS's service picture may be improving, but taxpayers are still running into real challenges. But first, agency reorganization plans can look clean on paper and turn out far messier in real life. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A year ago, the Interior Department pitched a sweeping reorganization as a way to save money and streamline operations. What the evidence actually shows about how that played out is the focus of my conversation with Tim Whitehouse, Executive Director of Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. Mr. Whitehouse, it is great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Terry. It's great to be here.
We are finding ourselves about a year out from so much of the DOGE activities at the beginning of the Trump administration that caught many people by surprise. And your organization has looked at one particular reorganization activity within the Interior Department. Interior pitched this as a way to save money and streamline operations. You've looked at some of the evidence. What have you found in terms of whether those goals were actually met?
We have found they're not met at all. The Department of Interior is a vast cabinet-level agency that manages America's natural and cultural resources and public lands. It employs about 70,000 people. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum started a massive reorganization, which he said its goal was to streamline efficiencies and save the Department of Interior money. So we wanted to know a year into this how it was going and what types of efficiencies were gained and how the agency was saving money. So we sent a Freedom of Information Act. To step back a little, Secretary Burgum had ordered approximately 5,000 administrative, information technology, and communication staff from all its constituent bureaus into the Secretary's office in order to streamline and save money. So these would be people from the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the U.S. Geological Survey. And so all these people came to the Office of Secretary from these constituent offices. The goal was to optimize and create efficiencies across the department by improving processes and elimination of redundant efforts. And we found through our FOIA that the Office of Interior had no records of saving money or building efficiencies. In fact, we found quite the opposite.
This kind of a reorganization sounds like efficiencies through providing central and shared services, admin, IT. Many agencies do that. What happened inside the Department of Interior so that the reality maybe diverged from what was promised?
So there was no plan in the Department of Interior to actually save money. This happened very haphazardly. It was not well thought out, and in our view, was designed to inflict trauma on the employees. It was part of the administration's effort to downsize. And so the work, for example, of the National Park Service and the people that do IT or communications for the National Park Service is very, very different than the United States Geological Survey or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And throwing all these people into the Office of the Secretary, 5,000 of them, without clear goals, without clear management structure, without adequate support, created chaos and trauma among the staff. And they've largely reported publicly how difficult and inefficient this has been.
Thinking about this from the individual Interior employee perspective, did they have to move? Were they just realigned on paper? Did they get new reporting chains? What exactly was their experience?
So many people did not have to move, so they had new reporting chains. Some people did have to move. So people found themselves without managers, no one directly supervising them. People found themselves with managers that had no idea what they did for work. And people were left sort of to flounder in the Office of Secretary. And many of them have left. Thousands of people have left. This was occurring at a time when the Department of Interior was making every effort to push people out of the department. And so this was really, I think, part of that effort to create uncertainty and trauma in these employees using the cover of creating greater efficiencies.
Tim Whitehouse is Executive Director of Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. Mr. Whitehouse, we're looking primarily at cost here, but efficiency is a key piece as well. Do you have any data? Have you been able to collect any data on how well these important functions were operated during this reorganization?
Yeah, so the Department of Interior set no goals for efficiency. It has no public-facing things that it stated it wanted to achieve other than broadly speaking efficiencies. And so by every measure that we've been able to gather, and that's largely anecdotal, it's created quite the opposite. So we know, for example, in the National Park Service, their full-time staffing is down to 12,600 people from 16,000 in January 2025. In addition to having people pulled into the office of the secretary, they now need almost everything signed off by the secretary's office that they do. So it's created huge backlogs in things from simply purchasing items that they need to run parks to communicating with the public about what's happening in the constituent parks. So it's really started to degrade the functions of the bureaus in the Department of Interior.
One of the other reorganizations that we've heard about inside Interior is the firefighting and wildland fires function. Did that get rolled up in this broader efficiency and cost savings effort?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So the Trump administration, and I don't have an exact answer to this except to say that the Trump administration is looking to merge, as I understand it, the firefighting functions of the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Interior. And what we're hearing from people involved in firefighting is that they are very concerned about the chaos that will create in what promises to be a very, very active fire season this year. Things are very dry out west. There's a lack of snow cover, and many of the administrative support functions that are used to support the firefighting efforts have been severely degraded, and many of the people have left. So once this fire season starts, there's significant concern that there will not be enough support to provide the resources necessary to fight these fires, and maybe we should be able to fight them.
Interior is not the only federal agency that proposed significant restructuring, massive workforce relocations. We're hearing it from the Department of Agriculture, from other organizations that your organization stays in touch with. When you think about these kinds of proposals, and you've seen them come and go, what do agencies consistently underestimate when they think that a large-scale restructuring is just going to save money and make things better?
Yeah, so I think that is often used as a tool to justify reorganizations in government, but I would say that's often not the real reason. Here, we don't really know the real reasons of why they're doing this. We tend to think, as I've mentioned before, that it's to get people to leave. It's an effort to downsize the federal government and to give the secretaries of these agencies more control over the agencies. So the obstacles they run into when they do these reorganizations is oftentimes at a higher level, they don't understand the leadership. The new leadership doesn't understand the work that people actually do. And so they're moving things around on paper without recognizing the effects that may have in the communities throughout the country.
What do they also then not understand about the costs of reorganization inside the government?
So I think, we have a very conservative government that wants to downsize the federal government. And I think they can do that. Congress has provided them with the tools necessary to do that. And there are procedures that they need to follow that Congress has put into law. The Clinton administration downsized the federal government. It took them a few years to do that. They worked with Congress to do that. This administration could have done that also, and they could have done it in 2 or 3 years, and they could have, with Congress's support, achieved significant efficiencies from their perspective. But they haven't done that. They haven't sort of articulated a plan, looked at where they want to cut expenses, and worked with Congress to do that. They've gone off on their own. It's part of their effort to create trauma, to get people to leave the government, and to give the secretaries power, as much power as possible, irrespective of the law or the Constitution.
What is the next step in Pierre's investigation here of the Department of Interior?
So the Department of Interior, we're very concerned that Interior Secretary Doug Burgum is making the Department of the Interior an instrument of presidential power and using the Department of Interior to purvey sort of Trump's narcissism in our perspective. and he's working to integrate himself and ingratiate himself into the president's inner circle and stay there. And so we're looking at how the Department of Interior is spending its money, how it's treating its employees, and whether it's following the law and the Constitution, its leadership, as it's required to do.
Been speaking with Tim Whitehouse. He's the Executive Director of the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Terry. I appreciate it.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, the IRS's service picture may be improving, but taxpayers are still running into real challenges. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Taxpayer Advocacy Panel's 2025 annual report surfaces nearly 200 recommendations on where IRS communications and services continue to break down. Philip Wong, National Chair of the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel at the IRS, explains what taxpayers are still struggling with and how their feedback helps to shape what changes next. Mr. Wong, thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
The Taxpayer Advocacy Panel just released its 2025 annual report at a moment when the IRS service levels may be improving in some areas, but frustration remains. What taxpayer problems did TAP most want to surface right now?
I think in the climate of, we hear a lot of reduced staffing and services. I think that's one half of the picture. I think the other half is how to expand IRS reach with existing infrastructure, right? So we're really proud of the recommendations we've made on the online account. It's one of 188 recommendations you'll see in the report, but really looking at the digital now and future in serving taxpayers where they are.
We'll come back to those specific recommendations in a minute, but I want to back up a bit and talk about the advocacy panel. For people who may not know it well, walk us through what the panel is, what its focus area is, and how you work.
Got it. Great question. TAP stands for Taxpayer Advocacy Panel. We're actually a federal advisory committee commissioned to help improve the IRS, right? Really representing the voice of taxpayers across the nation to form these recommendations in meaningful ways to represent both the needs of the taxpayers and address them where they are.
And how do you collect the input?
Another great question there. So we have a website, improveirs.org. We have a submission box there. We also do a lot of outreach, boots on the ground to talk to taxpayers and citizens across the nation. The panel is made up to 75 members across all 50 states, even international as well. So those expats. And so whether it's word of mouth, we hear it, I put pen to paper, and that's how an idea or feedback becomes a recommendation.
And do you focus primarily on the feedback from individuals, or are you looking at corporate feedback, the whole gamut of anybody who's paying taxes?
Anybody who's paying taxes, but I must say that the individuals have the loudest voice. They're the ones engaging with our idea submission system, and but we encourage every taxpayer to provide us their feedback. It's important to note that we do identify what ideas and feedback can be systemic issues and systemic recommendations and improvements, not just individual tax payer issues or suggestions like change the tax law.
You mentioned that the 2025 report includes nearly 200 recommendations, and they cover areas like notices and correspondence and online tools. When you step back and you think about that volume of feedback, what did you learn about the actual taxpayer experience?
I think it's a tapestry of experiences, right? I think you have taxpayers in rural environments, taxpayers who still prefer paper correspondences, still submit their tax returns by writing it out themselves. I only know my experience, and that's what I came into TAP with. But after, this is my third year, I realized there are so many entry points to the beginning of the taxpayer journey for the IRS to manage and to manage effectively. And I think they do a great job. They're so dynamic and staffing during the tax season. They're really thinking forward and creating chatbots, even the new online account. Is anything perfect? Does anything address 100% of taxpayer needs? No, but I think if you take a step back and look at the whole picture, they're doing a great job of servicing millions and millions of taxpayers every year.
What were some of the biggest trends that caught your eye?
Other than, where's my refund during tax season is what we see a lot being submitted. Um, I think people want more frictionless and more variety, surprising to hear, of interaction and lines of help. So what I mean by that is, for example, the Taxpayer Assistance Center, they would like, walk-in days. And we've had that in the past. The IRS has hosted those in the past. So I think people want more of that. Waiting on the line on the phone is a big thing, right? And so, for example, the callback feature that was implemented a few years ago, that arose from TAP, right? And so it's small things, but meaningful changes, more information on the online account, right? And so you see these iterative changes happening across many different platforms to really modernize the taxpayer experience.
Philip Wong is the National Chair of the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel at the Taxpayer Advocate Service in the IRS. Do you feel like the IRS really understands the digital versus hard copy landscape out there? Are they trying to push everyone eventually to digital, or is there always going to be an opportunity for folks who are hard copy submitters?
I think there's definitely guardrails, so to speak, and a clear nudge to adopt a digital first approach. And, I don't mind it as long as those paper options aren't completely eliminated. But like Aaron Collins, the National Taxpayer Advocate, always mentions, paper is the IRS's kryptonite. And I can understand why. Even the volume of notices going out and coming back in, that takes a lot of logistics and, even supply chain demands on just finding the paper, finding the ink, finding the printers. And so the less paper, I think, the better. And I could speak for myself, only for myself, but, sometimes I don't want to talk to a person. Sometimes I want to engage without, having to actually be on the phone. And so I think digital engagement is the way of the future, but it's not to discount the need for more manual in-person help for those that need it.
One of the issues I think that's carried over the last couple of years that's sort of related to this digital divide is electronic refunds. The IRS was going to go to 100% electronic last year. They delayed that until this year, and there's still been some concern around folks who maybe are unbanked or don't have that capability and prefer to receive paper checks. How has TAP engaged in that conversation?
Definitely has been in the forefront, especially in light of all the new executive order to go paperless check. I think this tax season, as we work through the recommendations, TAP would be at the front line to really understanding what pain points have been revealed in the new process, right? So like if you don't put your bank information, you actually get a letter asking the IRS asking you to input or provide that banking information. And this actually delays the paper check, so up to 6 weeks from the date of filing. But even in the letter, right, it doesn't communicate that. But I think perhaps that's intentional, and like we're nudging the taxpayer to create an online account if they can. But there's also ways to respond to that letter to say, hey, I actually have a valid reason for not being able to receive that refund electronically. And so hopefully taxpayers are better prepared next year. But this year was the first year, so I can understand it's going to be a critical year to gather that feedback and provide a meaningful recommendation by next year on that paperless journey.
One of the other challenges the IRS has faced for decades is modernizing its IT system. What input do you, through TAP, have with the IRS as they're thinking about modernizing and balancing the operational efficiency needs that the IRS wants to create with the user interface customer experience from taxpayers?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something I was totally blind to before TAP. As we work with the IRS and we request the presence of subject matter experts to come help us work through some recommendations. Some things we recommend may seem commonplace to us or, be very intuitive. But what I quickly realized was that there's a lot of technical debt at the IRS that they have to work through, and they have many disparate systems, and I'm glad to hear that they're working on unifying those different systems, right? So one of the things we asked was, why isn't every single notice on your online account if you do have an online account? We found out that certain notices are generated by System A, other by System B, and others by System C. So without having a central repository, it's really hard to centralize that data so that it can be conveniently presented to the taxpayer in real time, right? I worry about my mail being stolen, right? And so like these are things, services that every taxpayer should have access to, or at least be able to opt into. But there are technical barriers that are behind the curtains where a simple request like I should receive every notice as a digital copy if I wanted to. That seems simple, right? It's one organization, but IRS is probably one of the biggest employers in the nation. And that is oftentimes neglected or underappreciated.
As you look towards the rest of 2026 and your term as the panel chair, what's on your agenda? What do you hope to see the IRS make progress in?
Hopefully all areas, right? I'm aspirational, but I'm also very pragmatic. Internally, I've called every member, reminding them of why we joined the panel. We're all volunteers. We're passionate about tax administration for one reason or another strange reason, and really putting pen to paper. And so we have different project committees, and I think the diversification of these committees help us cover all the different types of ground. So we have the special projects, and we have international taxpayers working on things that are very probably niche, not a lot of taxpayers work on, all the way down to toll-free lines. I think my personal emphasis, I would love to see some great modernization and the options available to engage with toll-free, even if it's a non-phone method, right? And for example, is being able to queue a callback digitally, right? Sometimes I know there's a way, so why would I call to hold on a way to request a callback where I can just say, hey, do you mind calling me tomorrow? Or I would like a call tomorrow, But again, I know it's a simple sounding ask, but there's a lot of layers behind it that I know that the IRS has the unenviable task of trying to prioritize what's most important.
I've been speaking with Philip Wong. He's the national chair of the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel at the Taxpayer Advocacy Service at the IRS. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for sharing the important work that the panel is doing.
Thanks for having me. And, this is a great reminder that you don't have to be on the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel to submit your ideas and your recommendations to help improve the IRS.
We'll post this interview and a link to the annual report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Federal agencies doubled their number of AI use cases over the past year. That's according to the latest inventory maintained by the Office of Management and Budget. There are now more than 3,600 use cases documented across the government. Greg Barbaccia is the Federal Chief Information Officer and Chief AI Officer. In a conversation with Jason Miller, Barbaccia gave us an update on Federal News Network's 2026 AI and Data Exchange.
It's exciting. It's up 70% from the previous year, and agencies are really embracing responsible experimentation. With how fast the technology is moving, I thought people would be moving a lot quicker and maybe a little more recklessly, but people are being very responsible. So we're happy to see that.
I noticed that as you go through it, there's all the different types of use cases, right? Some are in production, some are in pre-production, some are retired even. Did anything from a trend perspective, beyond the fact is responsible experimentation, the numbers stand out to you as you kind of started to look through those use cases?
Sure. So kind of unsurprisingly, the scientific use cases are at the top. So DOE, HHS, NASA's doing a lot of stuff. NASA's doing interesting things around AI solutions to analyze data coming back from the Mars rover. DOE is using it to accelerate new material development. So it was exciting to see all these scientific use cases.
At the same time, one of the things you all through the administration have been really focused on is effectiveness, efficiency, really to drive kind of the workflow. As we've seen over the last year or so, fewer federal employees, AI is really looked at to drive some of that improvements. Is that another area that you have said, oh, there's some really good examples that we can maybe expand across the government?
Yeah, absolutely. We're trying to augment the federal workers and making their lives easier. It's very frustrating when you come into federal service and you don't necessarily have access to the tools you do in your private life. So trying to get automated away some of these mundane, repetitive tasks, people really enjoy that.
As you guys were going through the use cases, was there anything outside of the normal that you just were like, oh my goodness, like, again, I'll use the word surprise, but also kind of in that either pleasant or unpleasant surprise?
Yeah, a pleasant surprise was public comment analysis, something, I guess the layperson citizen isn't too familiar with, but when the government does a new regulation or another rule, we post it for public comment. And, sometimes we get tens of thousands of comments. When a human has to go through that, a lawyer's time is very valuable, and that just takes so much longer. So we're saving hundreds of thousands of staff hours with that. Lawyers can focus on understanding and responding to the public instead of having to figure out which arguments are exactly the same and parsing through all these things. So how impactful that type of use case is across all the rulemaking agencies is really nice to see.
We actually have, as part of the AI Day Exchange, an interview with Casey Mulligan, the Chief Counsel for Advocacy at SBA, who talks exactly about that use case, where they just got so much comments and regulatory reform look back and how AI has really helped them. Greg, plenty to talk about AI use cases. I'm going to shift over to another bit of news that you all put out just recently, OMB memo around CIO authorities. If you could just offer a little bit of comment on that issue, but also how it relates to how CIOs can use that authority to better oversee, manage the buying implementation of AI tools.
Sure. The marvelous mega memo, long time in the works. I'm super proud to have gotten that out. We need to target shadow IT. So these agencies are so large, there's so many subcomponents. Oftentimes a shop like a CFO shop will do their own technical procurements. And when that's happening outside of the purview of the CIO, that's when duplicative technology comes. We're not negotiating the same. So kind of reinforcing FTARA, reinforcing some previous statutes as well, to allow the CIO to be what they're statutorily required to be, the ultimate technical authority at the agencies. And then what's interesting is now we're asking for reporting to my office. And now we could help support this whole of government effort we're trying to do, where I could see renewals from the big vendors across the entire government. And this helps with negotiations. When we were doing all this procurement consolidation early in the administration, one of the complications was privity of contract. The vendors would say, my contract isn't with OMB, it's not with the General Services Administration, so I can't share that pricing data. So now we're asking agencies to bake that allowance into solicitations, into contracts going forward. And now we could look at the span of technology across the entire federal enterprise, which makes our negotiation capability far stronger.
The reinforcement of CIO authorities, FTARA, as you said, very important. But it sounds to me like the most important piece here is baking that kind of contract clause in there to say, we can see across the government what you're paying at Interior versus Agriculture and compare those terms and conditions and compare that. Is that to you the biggest win here?
Absolutely. Look, executive orders and memos, these things don't self-effectuate, right? We need some sort of reporting requirements so we can analyze the data. And 2610, I'm very excited about because we are really going to operationalize this data and use it to drive decisions. Bureaucracy sucks. And when we just ask people to send these reports into the ether and we don't do anything with them, that's bad for morale. So the CIOs are really excited about how we're actually going to use this information.
And of course, the concern that I've heard is another report from OMB. Have you guys, I know it's still early, you guys still probably are working through some things and you haven't even gotten the first set of reports yet, but have you started to talk about how you're operationalize these reports? Because it could be a ton of data. And that's why I'm setting you up for a little AI discussion. You know that.
Yeah, of course. We're going to deploy AI against it, obviously. And what's important to note is that we only ask for 6 months of data for the initial call. We'll likely extend it, but instead of just doing this arbitrary, indefinite data exchange, what we're going to do is take that 6 months of data and understand how do we tweak it to make sure the burden is worth what we're doing with it. So just figuring out what it looks like now and then into the future, how do we change that to make it less burdensome?
And again, I think that's the key here. CIOs, okay, if I'm going to give data and collect data, I want to see that return. What comes from it? To your point, if it just goes on and on and on and on, there's probably a feeling there's not a lot of return. Shifting more broadly outside of the memo and maybe some of the budget areas, what is OMB's kind of view about looking at, when it comes to AI, the implementation side? Okay, you guys don't put your hands in it. You guys don't do the coding. But a lot of times agencies, when they're looking at AI and say, okay, how do we use it? Where do we find the right places? How are you starting to drive some of that sharing, some of that use case? Hey, you have a use case over here. There's a use case over here. Let's connect those dots.
Sure. So we have the Federal Chief AI Officers Council that I chair, and we're using it to, for the first time again, move forward whole of government. What's really exciting about AI is not only do we have an opportunity to deploy tech inside the government at the speed of the commercial sector, but we can do it all together. So we're convening a lot of subgroups within that organization to understand, all right, who's writing position descriptions using AI? What models are you using? What's the orchestration of the model? How are you interacting with it? And let's figure out in one room, what is the best implementation for the government? So we don't have people doing different procurements for the same use cases in different ways. And that also allows for a more efficient public employee, because you could jump around from agency to agency, as civil servants often do, and be immediately relevant and not understand a completely different way of doing business. So in addition to that, we're also identifying all the pain points agencies see for AI, procurement, IT security, privacy, what works with integration, what doesn't, and how to evaluate cost and kind of drive these negotiations through GSA together as one as well.
The CAI Council, you mentioned some subgroups. Are they some newer subgroups? Are you just reinvigorating some of them? And then how often are they meeting? Just give me a little bit more background, because I think that drives a lot of these changes you're talking about. Is, hey, do we meet monthly or weekly or however often?
Yeah, they meet monthly, and I'm happy to say they're self-organizing. So when we have the larger council meetings, we say, what are the topics du jour? And then people self-organize around getting together and doing group projects. An interesting one that came out was templates for adoption. So again, the chief AI officers who are interested get in the room, they come out with a template, and then we share it with all the other agencies. So we're not reinventing different things 24 times across the CFO Act agencies.
The big challenge I think OMB's had over the years is say, hey guys, here's a great template, use it, getting folks to use it. Is there another level down where you're sending in kind of experts? Again, maybe not OMB specifically, but hey, if the Commerce Department developed this template and they are the experts, do they go help, the Treasury Department or so on and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody wants a piece of the AI pie because it's the new shiny thing, right? So there's no shortage of people coming out of the woodwork, and we're running the council with no ego. So OMB is here to empower the agencies in this administration. So we're taking anybody who's interested to come in and talk and help us out for sure.
You also mentioned working on AI procurement. I know you have a close relationship with Kevin Rhodes, the OFPP administrator. You guys at OMB also put out some memos around responsible buying and smart buying of AI and procurement. Maybe talk a little bit about that relationship with OFPP, how you guys are kind of trying to march in lockstep to make that buying of AI more straightforward and, again, easier.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Rhodes and I work closely together. This is new technology. We can't think about it in the same paradigm we thought about cybersecurity or cloud service providers. This technology moves very quickly. You have to keep on top of it day to day in a lot of places. 90-day cycles, it's completely different than what we saw. And also how it interacts with data across our environments is really different. So we have to make some of the way we do procurement more living and not these kind of archaic policies that existed in the past. And it's an exciting time because we're doing a revolutionary FAR overhaul, and we're allowed to use that to focus on what makes sense for technology adoption, not just, normal commodity solutions.
That's Greg Barbaccia, the federal CIO. Watch his full conversation with Jason Miller at federalnewsnetwork.com. Search AI and Data Exchange. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.